Hey, it's Django from the Shaping Fire podcast. I want to thank Kevin Jodrey, Wonderland Nursery, and the Gangier for sharing this video with us. This is part one of two. Part two is going to come out later on this week. We're going to add the link at that time right here, so you're probably seeing it now. In this video, Kevin considers late 80s really loud and skunky terpene profiles that we found in weed then that have gone away because during the times people were getting busted and they needed to have their weeds smell more fruity and floral than danky and skunky. And so he wants to come back to that. So in this video, he discusses the terpene profiles that are generally associated with really loud strains from that time. If you're interested in hearing more from Kevin, I recommend that you check out the other Shaping Fire podcast interview I did with him in 2017, all about the early origins of the CBD strains that started in California. You can find that out at the link here. Or you can just go to the shapingfire.com website. While you're there, if you are into terpenes, make sure that you listen to the interview I did with Ben from True Terpenes as well, all about terpenes and how they're used in your everyday life. And if you are into terpenes and you want to buy some for yourself or to use in production for a product that you're making, make sure you go to this link to go to True Terpenes and pick up some terpenes because they're the ones who sponsor our channel. So thanks to Kevin and Wonderland and the Gangier and True Terpenes for all the support. All right, here we go.
This is Kevin Wonderland. I was spending some time trying to take a look better at the older strains from late 80s, early 90s, which to me is a sweet spot of cannabis. That it was this incredible amount of varietals that pooled to make those varietals. And they were the only ones taken out of play, not due to obsolescence, but more to the fact that they were too highly recognizable in something that I call BC, and that's before charcoal. So before charcoal filtration was really prevalent and allowed individuals to hide cannabis in discrete situations, some of these varietals from that time period, primarily what we call skunks, were so well known to the scent that it was an instant indicator that there was cannabis being produced at this location. And so it completely took these strains out. And I've been going back in time to dig through to re-pull this population out because the varietals were built at that time for total enjoyment from the user's perspective. And some of these scents have been lost, and it's trying to mine them and find out where they exist. And so I've been working with this strain called the Hog out of San Diego for a little while. And it's a beautiful skunk Afghani combination. And the genetics that make it up go back to that time. This might have been made 20, 25 years ago. So a little later than where I'm speaking. But the precursors, the plants that made it up, combined and did this. And so we did an interesting test this year where we ran a humic acid mix from a company as a test to see what it would do on production. And when I ran all the terp analysis, I had the Pure Analytics, my lab, who I've used from the inception, run my terp profiles. And so what I find, which was so interesting, was that they had some very extreme variances in one specific area. But the overall smell was identical to the user. You couldn't differentiate between the two flowers, even though one of them was 1% camphene and the other one was 1% total pinene, alpha and beta pinenes combined. And one of them is pinene's pine, and the other camphor is more of an herbal. And so it was amazing to me as I started to look at these and try to understand from a terp profile analysis what the smell really was and what was really taking place. And so I started to wonder, where does the smell garlic come from in garlic? And why does this flower, the Hog, have such a heavy garlic odor? So I went through the basic terp profiles, and we had alpha pinene, which are pines. We had, and then the flip sample was it had no pinene, had camphene, but basically the same level, about 1%. And so that was really the only major difference in the two. And then myrcene was dominant. We had limonene, and myrcenes are earths and musks, and limonene are citruses. And we had linalool, which is a spicy floral, fenchol, which is a camphor. Carophyllene, which is a hoppy, peppery, humulene, which is earthy, woody. Then we went into some of these lighter ones, which was a valencine, which is an orange, and then farnesene, which is woody, neuralidol, citrus apple rose, neuralidol, barky woody, and then guaiol. I can't really pronounce the word. Guaiol, and that's piney. And so I took a look, and these were the major terps that made up what we talked about. And I started to do some research, and I started trying to find out, where is this smell, or that we call like funky death, and where does these things come from? And I started to take a look, and I started to find out that farnesene, which is farnesol, is the precursor to all sesquiterpenes, but farnesene, the terp itself, is the death smell of aphids. And so plants exude that smell to drive predation away from it, because it smells like insect death. And then if aphids die, they release that odor, which then tells other aphids that their death is present and that they should hide. And so it started to it drive some interest in terms of, are we picking up some of these funky tones that are really bioprotectants, and we're interpreting them in a way that makes us perceive something. And so I started to take a look at this, and we started to go through, and we took a look, and we find that geranol is the precursor for all the monoterps, and farnesol is the precursor for all the sesquiterps. And I started to take a look and trying to understand, what are some of the reasons why this stuff works? Why do we have some of these smells? And we've been talking about esters, which are alcohols, and we find that you have alcohols that are glycerides, and glycerides make up fat, and so almost all fats in animals and plants are from glycerides, and that is from esters. And so we start to say, as we go back, we always remember the sticky, the oily, the greasy, things that we don't see as much anymore, things that don't have the same tactical feel, same constituents that make it up. And some of those things I think are directly connected. And so I started to take a little look deeper. And as I started to go into this, I started to find that things like valencene, which is orange, which you can smell so clearly in this. You don't smell citrus in the sense of lemon, lime through your hog flower, but if you give it a squeeze, you're going to have this sour garlic, and you're going to have this underlying citrus tone, but you can smell a distinct orange over a lemon or a lime. And you have a muskiness that typically would come from myrcene. But when you look at the profile of a hog and an OG, limonene, myrcene, pinene, and we'll use the pinene sample instead of the camphene, because like I said, they smelled identical when you compared them. But for OG Kush, which is typically, we would say, limonene, pinene, myrcene dominant, it couldn't be any different than the hog. And they both have similar profiles. And so I started going through this, and I started trying to understand better, like, what makes these things happen, because we all become very terp aware, but they work in combination, in conjunction with each other. And there's also conversions. And what I started to find was the valencene, which is this incredibly Valencia orange smell. They take valencene, and I had to write this down so I get the name straight, but you can use bacteria, and they do this in perfume industry and other industries, and they use a bacteria, and it converts valencene to a nootkatone. And so nootkatone is the most valuable of all grapefruit terps. And so this incredibly valuable grapefruit scent terp can be converted from valencene biologically. And so I started to take a look at, what is garlic, and why do we smell it, and why do we do? And garlic is something called an allicin ester, ALLICIN. And it doesn't release its smell until you crush it, but it's not because you volatilized it as much as you've crushed it and you've released enzymes which then react and go to process and then release this. So there's all these things that are taking place in how we perceive smells and tones. And when we're looking at terp reports and terp profiles, and I'm going to go through a bunch of these. I'm going to go through a lot of these older over the next couple of weeks as I get a chance. I'll go through some of these profiles pertaining to some of these older varieties I'm sifting through. And what it'll do is it'll let us kind of take a look at what's a terp profile compared to what's the actual strain. What do we really smell? And when we look at these things, where do we not see these odors? Meaning that I should see, with all the pines and earths, I should see a lot more in this thing. But really what I have is a sour funk, a garlicky tone, an underlying orange, and a little bit of earth. And it would make sense because we have so many earthy terps present. But the irony was when I started to compare all these profiles, I started to see such similarities between things that we have now and things that we had in the past. And it's primarily these alcohols that make these differences in the strains that were from the past. And now that we know that these esters are directly related to the fat production in plants and animals, this thing, it starts to make sense because we remember these strains being so sticky and so greasy, and we assumed sticky from resins, but perhaps sticky from fats. And so as we mine back through these older strains and go dig through these profiles, I'll go and take a look through the terp profiles, and we'll start to try to understand better what are we looking at. And a lot of it is so that we can understand what makes it attractive and what doesn't. Otherwise, it's just basically these simple profiles of this, this, and this drive an attraction, this, and this give us a desire. Total amounts solely dictate desirability. And in a lot of cases, it's just not true. And it becomes confusing and misleading to us in terms of production. And when people start to look at cannabinoid profiles and then terpenoid profiles, and that becomes the basis of their decision-making process, it's not necessarily very accurate in terms of how we perceive it through the mouth and through the nose. And so I spent some time just over the Christmas break having a few minutes to hang out. And I just went through and listed this stuff and went through and started trying to understand, you know, why do we have some of these odors that we do and why do we not? And trying to understand the subtleties in it, because it's always the subtlety that determines quality. It's not gross characteristics. It's always the fine details. Both cars are cars. They both get you from point A to B. One of them has a better experience, and so we would typically consider that the better car. It's the same with cannabis. Whichever one gives you the best experience, how you perceive it, what it does for you in terms of medical usage, spiritual usage, however we want to define it. But all those characteristics are from perception. And when it comes to smell, we're so nuanced through the nose, it's such a direct connection from brainstem to nostril, that it's primal. It goes all the way back. And so we've been keyed to smell and understand so many things. But with cannabis, we've been necked into some populations now, and there's this drive to bring out higher, louder strains, and louder just meaning more visible to the nostril quickly, which means more aromatic at room temperature, so that's more volatile, so that's more monoterpene derived. And we have so many of these varietals now that we're working in those directions, but ultimately, is it giving you an enjoyable experience? And does it give you the effect that you desire from that terp profile? And a lot of the information when you get into terpenes is bioprotectants on how it affects against tumors and cancer and bone loss and tooth decay. And I mean, it's unlimited what you can do with this. But because none of this has been studied in a smokable form, always in applied to a thing, it doesn't really apply to us in the same way. It's extrapolating data from one set and putting it on another and kind of pretending that it's accurate, and we really know that's not the case. And it's really more a matter of trying to understand, how do you interpret the cannabinoid profiles, the terpenoid profiles, and also these esters, these alcohols that was so dominant and present in these cannabis varieties from the past that released such an incredible smell that was so distinctive to all people that eventually these varieties had to get removed from the system. And so it's this understanding that I'm trying to find as to what drove such an incredible desire in cannabis from those types, and how do we get back into some of those exotic forms of cannabinoid combinations and terpenoid alcohol combinations, so that we can get back into some of that desirability on a different direction. And we're not working the same populations that we're working, which are primarily right now so much of the OG directions. And I was just so fascinated with, because when we talk about, you know, the myrcene, pinene, limonene, where it's uplifting and then brings you down, the hog strains, skunk strains could be any opposite in terms of where they lift you up, but they don't bring you down. They don't have that same type of sedative effect, even though the myrcene level in this is relatively high. It's, you know, double the pines, even more than the carotene levels. The only thing that the hog had that was really high was trans neuralidol and CIS neuralidol, and so between the two of them, you were looking at almost 4.5%, and that's citrusy apple rose, that's barky woody, and all these complex tones that come into these varieties that make them taste so green, and green meaning subtleties of the earth and the forest within, and we can pull out some specific little pieces. And I would say, you have some hoppy taste and some wheatgrass or some lemongrass present, that beautiful, subtle orange tone. Myrcene is always this earthy component that when we crush this and volatile it, we can get it to come out. But so much of it is in my mind now as I see that we're having biological conversions of alcohols to other substances. We're having enzymatic conversions of something to something. So if garlic is an enzymatic conversion to a scent, then maybe we need to rethink how we approach the smell components of cannabis. And I'm not a terpene scientist. I'm just fortunate enough to get to listen to them frequently. But I'm somebody who's trying to understand, where is the desire in cannabis? Where do people like to go when it comes to cannabis? Where's the directions of cannabis? And this entire population from that, that late 80, early 90 time period prior to really smell BC, before charcoal, all of that was this incredible cannabis population that was still globally developed, meaning that the world had produced all these different cannabis varieties, and they had been clustered into these cannabis zones, and those zones of production created these varieties, and then lo and behold, as we go forward, the demand of the customer drives what people have. But black market forced some radical changes because there was a limit in what cannabis was available, and cannabis that was coming over at that time from, say, the remnants of Colombia, the remnants of Mexico, that cannabis was so much lower quality than the indoor produced in California, that even though the indoor from California had these reduced smell traits because we had turned them down, you still received a better, higher quality product than what was available. So the market became accustomed to that. And then as we start to go into medical marijuana and move forward, all of a sudden we had the ability to produce cannabis again in a protected manner, which allowed us then to have cannabis that was inherently louder, more distinct, a higher signature. And that brought the awareness back of, hey, where's all this good smelly stuff we had when we were younger? And so we go back and we realize we've necked all these things out. And so I've been on this hunt to pull stuff from that time period back from globally and try to locate these varieties so that we could go into them and start to say, what creates these smells really? We're all looking for the skunk pea, but we want it, but we want the skunk pea on a better chassis. The skunk pea that we're so caught up with in terms of skunk was always on the leafiest, cabbagey looking stuff you've ever seen in your life. It was never on really solid flowers, very, very rarely, primarily in a different type of morphological bud characteristic. And so I don't know if I'm so much seeking to go back, but I'm going to seek into those tones because there was also stunning other varietals, the burnt rubbers, the heavy citrus pines that were just dominant. You don't see any of that anymore, not to the same degree. No OG is piney like strains that were piney, and we just don't see them. They're moderated. Something's controlling these connections on how you perceive it. And so I think that as we go forward and we start to dig and look through the reports and then take a look at the cannabis and actually consume and test and say, hey, what do we see and what don't we see, it starts to become very informative. Because when I had 2 samples run that were almost identical in almost all characteristics, little fluctuations, but in pinene and camphene, no camphene in one, no pinene in the other. But you could put the flowers in the same container and no one could tell the difference. So it started to really make me realize, that some of these things that are so characteristically known are either subdued or enhanced by other terpenes, and what alcohols are present, and the degree that the alcohol is present. And that would be from a lot of it from the growing conditions, the inputs obviously, because it changed profiles here, and your harvest time and the curing windows and all these different pieces that control it. But it's going to be interesting as we go forward, because we're going to start to be able to take a look at profiles and start to find some really interesting markers, so that when we get into breeding and we're able to start to mark for some of these terpene indicators and look through genetically, do we have these markers, we should be able to start to go back into some of these plants that were extremely high in these volatile esters and alcohols, which are exceptionally attractive, but very hard to mine. You won't see it in concentrates because of the volatility. And it just starts to help us understand better what it is we're producing, what it is we're trying to market to the public. And when people want, unique varieties, it's unique because why? What defines unique? And so much of this is being able to take your varietals and say they're unique because people like them for this. It has an applicability here. There's a demand for it this way. Not just it has a higher content than others, because ultimately that doesn't really, numerically it does make a difference on a shelf, but in terms of how people perceive it, radically different. And so when I spent the last, half a day trying to understand where's the smell of garlic coming from when I don't have any garlic terpenes or alcohols present in the testing, and we're only looking at a truncated test, it might be say like 30. And there might be over 200 possible, but those will be at levels that'll be so small. It's catalysts, things that change things that precursors, things that set things in motion. And so as we go forward and we start to really have a more in-depth test, and we're able to look at this a little different, we'll be able to start going in and moving some of these populations in these directions, I believe. And for me right now, it's just a fascinating time to be able to see this and do this, and actually have the chance to understand what made some of these things so attractive versus just it had a smell that was this, because we are having a hell of a time trying to replicate it. If skunk was easy to replicate, you would see terpene blenders blending it, and it would be present as a terp to add to things. But I don't see skunk piss on anything right now, period. So I know that some of these things are exceptionally hard to capture or create, and it's what made some of these varieties so attractive, and that's what's fun right now as we get to hunt and do. So the hog, you got me curious because your smell is unique, and I, for the life of me, could not figure out where it came from. So thanks for attracting me so much that I put the effort in, and I hope this video shines a little light on the chase of where these things come from. And remember, I'm not an organic chemist, and I don't claim to be one, and nor do I want to be one, but I'm someone who's fascinated with genetics and what makes something desirable. And in these things, we start to have desirability, just like when we look in cannabinoid profiles, we can start to find out that these cannabinoids influence the way the body accepts other cannabinoids, and it directly affects how you perceive this effect, because it is absolutely giving you an effect. And the understanding of that allows you to better tailor in what you're seeking, so that as we move into these different populations of people coming in, you're able to give them better choices, more accurate choices, and then they are able to understand why they made the choices, which lets us drive directions of breeding and plant choices towards those directions, so that we're not just creating and hoping people like it, but we're actually marking some of these incredibly attractive components that individuals find attractive, and figure out how to apply it. So I hope your holiday season went well, and thanks for listening to the vid. And I hope we got something positive out of it. Bam.